Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 51. To start us off is a question from Sahar from Iran, who says, I have a curiosity about different types of memory, since my boyfriend seldom remembers what I tell him, but he is good at memorizing poems. Can you explain this to me and him?
Well, first off, apologies. I still have this darn cold, so my voice is still rumbly, and I think I'm destined to be spliced a bunch of times here. But Sahar, you bring up a very interesting question. But first, just as some editorializing for me. So your boyfriend is good at memorizing poems. And if that's for the purpose of reciting poems to you, I would hold on to this guy above all costs because he is a prince. But back to memory. Memory, it may all be explained, as you allude to, by the fact that there's multiple types of memory. But there may actually be another explanation lurking here, and I'll get to that later. Okay, multiple types of memory. We know about this from previous episodes looking at dementia, Alzheimer's disease. Memory is not a monolithic process. There's different domains of memory. We can remember a vague feeling about a period. We could remember the months of the year in an automatic sort of way. I know everyone out there, all I need to say is the name Clemens von Metternich, and everybody is thinking of the Congress of Vienna of 1814. Memory, it just works that way. There's some universals. Memory can be embedded in certain senses. Memory can be this impressionistic, oh, I can't tell you any single event from that summer, but that was the summer I grew up. That was the summer the world started making sense, versus very detailed, concrete, repertorial, sequential memory, journalistic. So a whole array. So broadly, memories are divided along two dimensions. First one is how long have you had the memory? And that's our world of you look up a phone number back in the days when you needed to do that. And then you ran across the room back in the days when there would be a phone book on the other side of the room, and desperately fast in the hopes of still remembering the number. You dial it in, it's gone forever after short-term memory. Anything up to few minutes or so, 30 minutes, whatever. Then that transitions into long-term memory. What you had for breakfast today, the names of your great-grandchildren, what decade it is, where you went to college, memories stretching back from a few hours ago to many decades ago. And those used to be the two usual time domains. But in more recent years, people in the business have recognized there's a special subtype of long-term memory, remote memory, memory from your first years of life, what your native language was, what the lullaby was that your grandmother sang to you, all memories that go back three-quarters of a century. And what people see is that seems to be archived in a way that's much more resistant to time, more resistant to memory loss, memory problems, things of that sort, much more resistant than regular old long-term memory. So just as a reminder, back from the Alzheimer's section that we had, Alzheimer's, at least early on, short-term memory is just fine. Here, tell me these three numbers back again, and it works 20 seconds later. And amazingly, still remembering one's native language from back when, but long-term memory in the range of what month is it? Where do you live? That's what's damaged. Another domain is this broad dichotomy that's made between memory that you were conscious of, explicitly aware of, explicit memory, declarative memory. You know something, you know that you know it enough that you could work strategically with it, versus memory that is more automatic, more implicit. And that's another broad dichotomy. And in a very like basic kind of way, again, back to Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is all sorts of damage to explicit memory. What's the name of your spouse? What's the name of the country you live in? versus implicit memory, still knowing how to do stuff, automatic stuff could still be intact there. Now, what people realize is there's a bunch of subtypes of implicit memory. And that's interesting. The one most pertinent to memory failure with age and things like that is what's termed procedural memory. You know how to do something more than you consciously, declaratively, explicitly know that you know something. You know how to do something. You know how to ride a bicycle. You know how to play this section of a piece on an instrument. You know how to walk up and down a flight of stairs. Things that metaphorically your body knows better than you do. Your muscles know better than you do. So implicit procedural memory, how to do stuff. And these are all these wild domains of types of dementias where explicit declarative memory is just a disaster. Yet this is someone who still knows how to do this with their hands, can still do it automatically. In addition, in this realm of implicit memory, another domain is conditioned memories, physical memories, things of that sort, conditioned memories. uh, every time you were back in a place like where you were when that terrible thing happened, you feel an autonomic response. Your heart races. You feel out of breath. You feel your body remembers in a sense of remembering a very strong emotional presence. Also, your body remembers in your classic, ooh, here comes a shock, ring the bell beforehand, do it a bunch of times. Eventually, the ring itself will evoke this conditioned stimulus. What's going on there in terms of memory, breaking it down? Your body remembers that this bell is a good predictor of here comes dinner or here comes a shock or conditioned memory like that. Your body also has another realm of physical memory. Suppose oh, I don't know, you've got a long drive off road on this very bumpy, rocky road, and you're just jostling and it's going on forever. And that business of that night, when you're in bed, when you're almost falling asleep, your body kind of remembers that jostling motion. You spend the day at the beach in the water, and at night falling asleep, you're still remembering this implicit aspect of the waves coming in and out. Then there's things like priming, another implicit domain where, like, I don't know, you put somebody in a room and there's a picture of the ocean up there, and you ask them their favorite kind of detergent. And without them knowing that they've just looked at a picture of the ocean reminds them of tides. Then you remember Tide is the name of a detergent. People are more likely to say Tide, another domain of implicit memory. And that was a classic study showing that. Okay, so we've got conditioned fear responses implicit. We've got implicit procedural doing stuff in there. And then the whole usual conventional world of declarative memory, conscious stuff. So within that whole menagerie, that whole taxonomy, there then becomes another domain that might be interesting. And this is again in the realm of stuff that kind of initially might look like a memory problem, but may not actually be. So you sit down somebody and you sit someone who's clinically depressed. And a characteristic of major depression is there are certain characteristic types of memory problems, and it could be mapped onto different domains of memory, as we just heard about. But you could also discover there's another issue there where you sit down this person who's deeply depressed and say, hey, while I got you here, I'm going to give you the name of somebody, John Brown, who lives at 45 Maple Drive in Winnetka, Illinois, if that's where Winnetka is. And then you talk to him for a while, and 15 minutes later, you say, oh, by the way, do you remember the name of that person, where they live, the town, any such thing? And they don't remember it. They don't remember it. Oh, we're seeing a memory problem. What you may, in fact, be seeing is it's not a memory problem. It's a motivational problem. It's a motivational problem in that you're deeply depressed and like you're really going to expend any of your tiny smidgens of available cognitive load and psychic energy to remember an arbitrary name and a street address. The problem of motivation, lack of motivation, confounding seemingly a pure problem of memory in and of itself. This is a big issue because it can be very hard to differentiate between you don't remember it because your memory is not working right versus you don't remember it because you weren't sufficiently motivated. This is a problem. This is a problem even if you're studying lab rats and their memory. And what you do is you got to motivate them. You have to motivate them. So instead of like doing their memory training routine each day after they've had breakfast, you do it beforehand. And you set them up so that giving the right answer gets them one of their food pellets. They are motivated now to learn. Under a circumstance like that, you are very convincingly taking the motivational aspects out of the story. So you can now see what memory is doing in and of itself. And you can see a rat equivalent of that when you were studying rat models of depression, which is a rat would normally be way more interested in drinking out of this water bottle that's full of sugar water versus than out of that bottle. And you'll notice, oh no, this rat that you've induced a sense of helpless depression, and they're not distinguishing between the two anymore. It doesn't remember anymore. That's the one with the sugar water. Ooh, you've stumbled onto a memory problem. Maybe not. Maybe instead you've stumbled onto a motivational problem. The rat isn't bothering to remember which one is which because the sugar isn't motivating. It's feeling no pleasure, anhedonia, no anticipation, and it's simply not motivated to remember that's the one that tastes really good because nothing tastes really good. So, how do people get around this who study memory and they've got to subtract out the motivational aspect? And what you do is you take advantage of the natural curiosity that organisms have. Here's how it's done with rats, for example. You do what is called a novel object recognition task. You put a rat into a room, and there's two objects it has never seen before. One of them is a little round ball, the other is a one volume history of the Congress of Vienna, whatever. The rat has seen neither of them before, goes over and investigates them, investigates this one for a while, sniffing, and then that one, you can keep track of how much time. And you are not motivating them because they want food. You are motivating them because they're interested in ballistics and history. This is internally driven motivation, causing them to check out these two items. Great. Now you take them away and you bring them back the next day, and back in this same area is still that same old history of the Congress of Vienna. But now instead of a ball, there's a little pyramid shaped thing. And thus, you now tap into this rat's memory. Ooh, we were looking at that book yesterday, boring, seen that, done that. And here's this novel object. Whoa, isn't that interesting? Does the rat remember that this thing wasn't there yesterday? This thing is novel. If it does remember it, it now spends a whole lot more time exploring the pyramid than the boring old book. And if it doesn't remember the difference, it equally divides the time between the two. So that's a classic sort of testing technique for dissociating motivation. Just go with internal motivation, go with normal old curiosity, and that end arounds the business of, ooh, can you remember this difficult thing because your memory's working great, or because your memory's working great, and in addition, you're motivated to get your memory to work great. So that brings us to the potential punchline here, Saha, which is in some cases, one could be having the challenge of dissociating memory competence with motivation at it. So that could be. Also, by the way, without going back to anything I said earlier, if you happen to be thinking about ice cream right now, Think about what kind of ice cream you might be thinking about and see if perhaps some implicit priming has gone on here.
Okay, so now James from San Francisco asks, what do advocates of determinism do about jury duty?
Well, this is a wonderful question. And given our current environment, my guess is that in many courts in the land, if not now, very soon, if you air any reservations like that, they're going to send you off to Guantanamo soon afterward. But let's ignore that for the moment and look at this general issue. Are you allowed to refuse to do jury duty for moral, philosophical, ethical, religious reasons? Yes, in lots of cases. For religious ones, if you're one of those like Amish or old Mennonite types, or where there's an explicit biblical instruction, you are not to judge others, which seems like a generally good idea. So that can get you off the hook. And that is one that I'm sure only works if you cite what is considered to be one of those cute, adorable, let's keep them in a museum, old types of religions. Um, Objecting to doing jury duty on philosophical grounds, moral grounds, that one is a much, much more uphill battle. In principle, that should work if you want to make this impassioned argument to the judge that we can't judge because who am I to understand this person's circumstance because they're so different from mine and mine of privilege. And I don't know, maybe you'll get some like bleeding heart judge who's probably going to sit next to you in Guantanamo in the cells there, but who would go for that? My sense is that works very rarely. Even more rare, I would guess, is to go in and say, I can't serve on a jury because I don't believe in free will. I think at that point, you've just mostly antagonized people in there. I've never actually had that experience. I've never been on a jury, and I got called up once for one. And all I had to say was that I was a neuroscientist, and both sides like fell over themselves to instantly like strike me off the list. So I never got further than that to get to say, and I'm a neuroscientist who doesn't believe in free will. My guess is the least likely route to do it is to accuse the judge of just being a biological machine and talking about how their inner building blocks are based on the same magnificent reductive biology by which a sea slug goes about learning things and making decisions, and that should work just fine. So I think within this landscape that nothing sells better in a courtroom for being excused from certain societal norms than claiming some religious exceptionalism, just saying, you know, there's no free will, and who am I to have anything to say about how this person turned out to be the sort of person they are? My guess is that's not going to go very far, unfortunately.
Finally, Brad from Georgia says, it's obvious that you both are animal lovers based on Doc's work with baboons and your frequent episodes with Safi in frame. Some dogs have this amazing skill to detect seizures in their owners before they happen, allowing the owners to prepare for the event. Could you possibly explain to us how they have the ability to do this?
Well, thank you, Brad, for any excuse for us to talk about dogs. Dogs are amazing. Animals are amazing. Animals are amazing in the sensory realms. There's a great book by the writer Ed Yong, fabulous writer, called An Immense World, which is sort of this tour of the obscure sensory worlds of other species, and there's stuff going on you cannot begin to imagine. But that includes dogs. Dogs, we know they have incredible olfactory stuff going on. We've got bomb sniffing dogs. We've got drug sniffing dogs. We've got body sniffing. I mean, not just sniffing your body, but corpse, cadaver dogs, things of that. Incredibly poignant detail back from 9/11, which was, in the aftermath, you talk to some of the like first responder medical people, and they all talked about the same thing, which is they got word, they saw what was happening, they heard all of that. And every emergency room in Manhattan, everyone sort of mobilized and said, well, we are about to have the most stressful, sleepless, demanding 4 straight days ahead of us. But this is everything we have trained for. We are going to save so many lives. And nobody came. Nobody came because there were no survivors to carry in. And apparently, it was the same thing for the cadaver dogs who were all over the site, who were trained to find the murder victim who's buried 3 feet under. And none of them were finding anything sufficiently so that some of the first responder teams decided their dogs were getting like a little bit discouraged and despondent, and they set it up where like one of the firefighters they put under some debris and put it on top and let the dogs discover this person, and yay, wonderful job, and here's a treat and we love you. And still the dogs being able to do what they do, which somehow that underlines that much more of the horrors of that day. Any case, dogs can smell stuff like that. Dogs can smell all sorts of things in the realm of health and disease. And what was initially anecdotal is not only well documented by now, but actually utilized in terms of animal training, dog training, to be able to detect cancers in people, to be able to detect a distinctive smell that's given off in that case, to be able to detect someone in a diabetic coma, to be able to detect someone with diabetes who's beginning to get into trouble with low blood glucose. And dogs can sense that, can smell that, and can be trained to alert their person to go do an intervention there. So that's totally wonderful and by now documented. And over the last 25 years or so, what was also just sheer anecdotalism initially has become a real thing. The fact that dogs can often sense when someone is about to have an epileptic seizure, in particular a grand mal seizure. Total anecdotalism early on, sufficiently so. In like 1999, there were papers with things like dogs detecting seizures in advance, fact or fiction. And by about 2000 was the first company that was training um, seizure alert dogs who could sense that it was coming. And they were beginning to show this was actually for real. And how could this be for real? Obvious interpretation was dogs could pick up on the minute body signals of somebody in the 30 seconds before the onset of a seizure. People have seizure auras of all sorts there. The dog pick up on. So it was like body language stuff. But no, the evidence got better and better that a dog could detect this from the next room over, that the dog eventually, as shown, could do it by odors alone. And what the field shifted to was a focus on what they called volatile organic compounds, airborne chemicals coming from someone who has a seizure, which could signal that they have indeed had a seizure. Cousins of pheromones, odorants that carry social information. In this case, the notion that someone with a seizure, something about the chemistry of it, their body gives up some sort of airborne odorant, which dogs can detect. So, first studies showing that that was actually absolutely the case. You get people with epilepsy, volunteers, and you would get a sample, a breath sample here, breathe into this bag, which we will now seal, or let's swab around here a couple of places on you with a cotton swab to get both breath and sweat samples in someone, a volunteer, shortly after they had had a seizure. And on some other occasion where they've been seizure free, and seeing can their dog, and they as their dog's human, can their dog differentiate between the smells there? And dogs could do it with better than 90% accuracy. They can do this. There's a distinctive smell. What people were then able to show was this didn't have to be trained dogs who could do this. And what would be the response that you would see? And this is like very dogs are the best. What would be the most typical response? Increased affiliative behavior on the part of the dog to their human. Then people showing with the same exact olfactory type test there, it doesn't have to be your human who could do this. So all of this is, hard-nosed science in the past recent years showing that a dog can detect the smell of someone, dog trained or otherwise, human that they know or otherwise, who has had an epileptic seizure. But that doesn't get us to the issue of, can they predict it beforehand? And finally, more recent studies are showing exactly that. And what would be the advantage of that? It's obvious your dog notifies you in whatever way is trained, and this is a sign, get on the ground, get into a safe position. If there's enough time, quick, take a rapid acting anti-seizure drug. And what was shown was people with these trained seizure alert dogs, not only did they have fewer injuries when a seizure would hit, but in the cases where they had time to actually take a medication, total number of seizures would go down. Okay, but how can you show that the dogs can predict this? And these were these very like motivated studies on the part of people with seizure disorders with their dogs, where they did prospective studies, studies in advance of seizures. These were people who volunteered to have a breath sample and a swab taken every hour for hours each day on the assumption that at some point they were going to have a seizure. And these were people who unfortunately had a high likelihood of that occurring. And then you could go and see, aha, look, they had a seizure 45 minutes after the last sample. Can the dog differentiate between the breath collected at that time versus other times? Go and do that study. And dogs were about 85% accurate at being able to detect this. And in this study, what they showed was an average of 68 minutes before seizure onset, dogs were statistically reliably able to differentiate between the smells of breath and sweat of their person destined to have a seizure in a little more than an hour versus destined not to. So this is a real phenomenon. This is how you do like hard-nosed science showing this. How is this working? And this is where I got really thrown off course, in that one of the papers talked about the molecule that most likely was mediating it. And this is a simple airborne volatile molecule called methone, which I went and looked this up. And at first I was very amused because every time you try to look up anything about methone, you get instead links to things about methadone and addiction treatments and stuff. So that took a while to cut through. And eventually just getting to methone itself and seeing there's absolutely nothing out there about methone and epilepsy. And I had to finally turn to a friend of mine, Robert Fisher, who's sort of the head of pediatric epilepsy here at Stanford. Very nice guy. So I emailed him and said, what's the deal with this methone stuff? And he emailed back and he said, well, actually, methone is a moon of Saturn, which turns out to be correct. He said, what you actually mean is menthone. And somehow I wrote it down wrong from the first one. I wrote menthone, derived from menthol, from peppermint oil, an essential oil. It turns out menthol is one of the constituents that appear to be distinctive in pre-ictal, pre-seizure breath and sweat in people. And people have since done studies to try to dissociate that from seizure coming soon, fear coming soon, seizure. You just did lots of exercise, and it seems to be somewhat specific to an epileptic seizure and extreme fear. So, this is where it hit into a wall in at least three different ways. First, there doesn't seem to be any pathway by which humans synthesize menthone, unless you're eating vast quantities of menthol, and even still, it looks shaky. Second, there's nothing to indicate peppermint oil novel pathways in the brain with respect to epilepsy. And third, something that Fisher emphasized himself was like there's nothing out there that could possibly explain a biochemical marker 68 minutes before a seizure occurs. So at this point, we've got a mystery as to how this might work, but the literature by now is pretty solid that people in advance of a grand mal seizure give off some sort of volatile organic compounds that could signal the onset of a seizure, the impendingness of a seizure, that dogs can detect this, that dogs can detect this with strangers and dogs without any training, and that trained dogs, incredibly charming in these papers, one of them referred to their dogs as our canine seizure scent detection team. They kept saying the team was mobilized at this point for part B of the study. And then at the end, they list the names of all the dogs and say they should all get nice steaks or treats or such. But that dogs can be trained to have extremely high accuracy of doing this. So, very good potential protective tool. Very unclear what the science is at this point.
And that is episode 51. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.